This PowerPoint presentation will examine the perfect competition model. This model is often held up by economists as an ideal in that it illustrates both allocative and productive efficiency and how both are brought about by competition in the marketplace. The model, however, has its shortcomings, and this presentation will examine those as well, and the unfortunate consequences that occur with government attempts to force real markets to behave like this model. Each firm incurs costs. To produce any product or service, a firm must pay for its land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurial talent. Given that all of these resources are scarce, entrepreneurs must compete with all other entrepreneurs to acquire them. In other words, the price of the resources is set in the same competitive marketplace as the products and services produced by the resources. Costs for a firm may be broken down into two categories. There are fixed costs and there are variable costs. Fixed costs, typically abbreviated FC, are those costs which are the same regardless of short-run production decisions. Whether the firm chooses to produce 1,000 units this month or 0 units this month, the fixed costs remain the same. Fixed costs might include such things as equipment or buildings or capital expenses, and they may also include things like insurance on the capital or costs incurred to maintain capital. Some firms may also consider labor or hired workers to be a fixed cost, depending on whether they pay them or keep them employed regardless of the immediate need for such workers. Then there are variable costs. Variable costs, typically abbreviated VC, are costs that go up or down depending on production. These costs would include costs for purchasing of raw materials or energy and labor should the firm choose to lay off or make additional hires on an as-needed basis as the business booms or ebbs. In the perfect competition model, and indeed in all four models this course will consider, we are not generally concerned with total costs, whether fixed or variable, but with average costs. That is, average cost per unit of production. We are also concerned with marginal costs, typically abbreviated MC. That is the additional cost incurred as a result of producing an additional unit of production. Computing average cost is a simple matter of taking the cost and dividing it by the number of units produced. Computing marginal costs is a matter of subtracting the total cost before the unit was produced from the total cost after the unit was produced. Examine the chart on this slide. Note that the fixed costs do not change as output increases. This is because these costs do not depend on output. As you divide the fixed cost by the output, the average fixed cost becomes lower as output increases. Variable costs, on the other hand, increase as output increases. Average variable cost, or AVC, may decrease or increase as output increases depending on whether the marginal, or additional costs, are greater than or less than the average at any given output. On the chart presented here, as we go from one unit of production to two, the total costs increase from $146 to $171. Thus, the marginal or additional cost is $25, noted on the far right side of the chart. The average total cost, or ATC, of $85.50 at output level 2, however, is significantly higher than the marginal cost of $25. Thus, the average is being pulled down lower. The average cost per unit will continue to fall as long as the additional or marginal cost is lower than the average for each unit produced. Once marginal costs rise above the average, however, then the average cost will begin to rise. In the chart, this occurs after the 9th unit of production. Logically, then, the most productively efficient level of production would be 9 units, as at this unit the average cost per unit is the lowest possible, or where ATC is equal to MC. Producing any more or any less than 9 units means the average cost be higher and therefore less productively efficient. By producing at its most productively efficient level, the firm is said to be realizing all possible economies of scale, or size. Of course, we'll find later that the firm is not primarily concerned with producing at its most productively efficient level of output, but rather concerned with maximizing profits. In addition to being productively efficient, economists also argue that perfectly competitive markets in long-run equilibrium are also allocatively efficient. Allocative efficiency occurs, according to the model, when the price is equal to the marginal cost. Thus, in long-run equilibrium, price is equal to average total cost is equal to marginal revenue. All curves come together at a single point. In the market illustrated here, this would occur at a price of $37, with each firm producing 9 units of output. The reason P equals MC is considered allocatively efficient is because the marginal cost curve is effectively the firm's supply curve at every point above average variable cost. The marginal cost curve represents the additional cost to society in terms of foregone alternative uses of the resources, while the price P represents the value of the final product the resources were used to produce. If P were above marginal cost, price greater than marginal cost, then it would indicate society would desire more of the product and less of alternative goods. If price were below marginal cost, society would desire less of the product and more of the alternative goods. Normally, the numbers presented in the previous slide in the chart are presented in graphical form. On this slide are typical cost curves for a firm. Note that after a certain level of production, marginal costs tend to rise. This is because the cost of necessary resources tends to rise as firms attempt to acquire more and more of them. Resources are scarce, remember, and firms must compete with all other firms to acquire them. To take one example, oil is scarce. To get oil, one must typically drill deep into the earth. Once one has used all the oil that is near the surface, one must go continually deeper, and this is more costly than shallow drilling. One might also have to travel to remote and hostile places to acquire additional oil once all the easily accessible and safe or comfortable places have been fully exploited. Thus, costs tend to rise as production increases. We also run into the economic law of diminishing returns. As production increases, it becomes increasingly difficult to squeeze more out of a fixed amount of capital resources. I can perhaps double production of tomatoes by adding a certain amount of fertilizer to my garden, for example. But doubling the amount of fertilizer will likely not result in a doubling of production. And doubling the amount of fertilizer again will not double tomato production again. At some point, production of tomatoes will begin to level out and hit a maximum, after which additional fertilizer will either be useless or even counterproductive, reducing the crop. If this were not true, I'd be able to feed the entire world from a flower pot. So marginal costs do tend to rise as production increases. Note in the diagram on this slide that ATC, average total cost, continues to fall until it crosses the MC curve, and then it begins to rise. Again, when you're adding a number higher than the average to the average will increase, and when you're adding a number lower than the average will decrease. Note also that the distance between the ATC, or average total cost curve, and the AVC, or average variable cost curve, tends to get smaller at higher levels of production. This also makes sense when you consider that average fixed cost gets smaller as you divide the fixed cost by an ever larger number of units produced. The distance between the ATC curve and the AVC curve is in fact the AFC. A note on profit and loss. Before we get into the perfect competition model, we need to re-emphasize that the goal of any enterprise is to maximize profit in the long run, and if necessary, minimize losses in the short run. Profit, however, must be understood in its broadest sense. Economic profits are not the same as accounting profits. An accountant simply deals with raw numbers in a ledger book. The accountant adds up the receipts from the sale, or computes the revenue, and then subtracts from that all of the business expenditures, or direct or explicit costs. If the result is positive, the accountant says the business is making a profit. If the result is negative, the business is said to be incurring a loss. Traditionally, profits are noted in black ink, thus the term operating in the black, and losses are written in red ink, thus the term operating in the red. Yet investors and entrepreneurs see profits somewhat differently than an accountant. The goal is not to just make a profit, but the profit, the largest possible return on the investment. Thus, if I work all day at my business and had only $10 accounting profit to show for it, I might decide to go out of business anyway because I see that I can invest my time and other assets elsewhere to make far more than $10. Perhaps I could take the money I sunk into buying equipment and other capital and put it into the bank to earn interest. Or I can employ my labor working for someone else to earn perhaps $100 a day in wages. On the other hand, I must not think just in terms of profit as money. Perhaps I get pleasure or satisfaction by working at the business I'm in, and that compensates me for the lost opportunity cost measured in money. This type of intrinsic reward or return on investment is impossible to measure in any objective sense, but it's there nevertheless and must be taken into account. One flaw in these mathematical models is that they cannot take this important real-life factor into account. We will get more into the flaws of the perfect competition model later on. The key to understanding the perfect competition model is to differentiate between the industry and the firm operating within that industry. The term industry means simply all of the firms competing with one another to sell the same or a similar product to a given group of customers. Thus, the airline industry may consist of several airlines such as United, American, and Southwest. In a perfectly competitive market, though, what we have is perhaps thousands of individual firms competing with one another in the sale of a product that is perfectly undifferentiated or identical for every firm. Thus, dairy farmers in the 1930s were all selling the exact same milk to milk buyers. One farmer's milk was as good as any other farmer's milk, at least according to this model. The only thing that mattered to buyers then was the price, which the buyer wanted as low as possible. Another condition for a market to be considered perfectly competitive is there must be unrestricted access to the market. Capital requirements for startup must be relatively small so that entrepreneurs and investors can get in easily and start up a business, and just as important, exit easily, or close the business. Finally, all firms must have equal access to information and resources. Each firm knows what the other firms are doing and has access to all production technology and necessary resources that are available to anyone who cares to bid for them in markets as accessible as the product market they are selling in. As you might guess, this is never the case in the real world in which we all live. Most important of all, there are so many identical firms competing that no single firm has any control or even influence on the market price. Each firm is just a small drop in a huge ocean of firms. They must simply accept the price as a given or a price produced by the laws of supply and demand. Because of these conditions, no individual firm in the industry can ever gain an advantage over any of the other firms. The diagram here illustrates how prices are determined in such a market. The price in the industry is determined by the interplay of the supply and demand curves we covered earlier in the course. The D, or demand curve, represents the consumer's willingness and ability to purchase the product at each possible price. As one would expect, the consumers will buy more at a lower price than at a higher price, and thus the curve slopes downward to the right. The S, or supply curve, represents the firm's collective willingness or inability to produce and deliver the product to the customers at each possible price. Where the two curves intersect will generate an equilibrium price that all firms must charge to their customers. If a firm attempts to charge any more than the equilibrium price, all that firm's customers will simply leave and buy from another firm selling at a lower price. If the firm attempts to undercut their competitors by selling at a lower price, they will find themselves suffering losses and go out of business. Thus, the D curve facing each individual firm, as opposed to the industry's demand curve, is perfectly elastic. The firm can produce and sell as much as it pleases, just so long as it charges the equilibrium price, and no more and no less than that. The firm's demand curve in the case of a perfect competitor is the same as the firm's marginal revenue curve. Recall that marginal cost meant the additional cost incurred as a result of choosing to produce one more unit. Well, marginal revenue is simply the additional revenue gained as a result of choosing to sell that unit to a customer. Firms will only find it in their interest to produce a unit if they can get more additional revenue from the sale of that unit than they incurred in additional cost as a result of producing it. To incur additional costs from producing a unit greater than the additional revenue would result in a reduction of the firm's profits. The firm logically would choose not to produce such a unit. Because marginal costs tend to rise while marginal revenue remains constant, or as we shall see when studying other models, tends to fall, firms will increase output until MR equals MC. After that point where MC is greater than MR, the firm will not produce. The firm will not stop short of that point either, since doing so would leave units unproduced that could have added to total profit. For all units produced prior to M equals MC, MR is greater than MC. These are profitable units. For all units produced after MR equals MC, where MR is less than MC, those are loss units and will not be produced. In this slide are three possible short-run outcomes for an individual firm operating in a perfectly competitive market. In the first case on the left, the firm is breaking even. This means the firm is making just enough accounting profits to make it worthwhile to stay in business and produce. The equilibrium price in this case is $20 and the firm is producing 8 units of production. Note that the firm's demand curve is labeled here as its MR curve. The firm's demand curve, as opposed to the industry's demand curve, again is perfectly elastic. What this means is that the firm can sell an infinite quantity of the good, or all it's capable of producing, but only so long as it stays at the equilibrium price determined by the intersection of the industry's supply and demand. In the diagram on the left, each time the firm sells an additional unit, it gains an additional $20 in revenue, the same as the price. Thus, MR is equal to D. In some diagrams, you may also see the firm's demand curve labeled as an average revenue, or AR curve, to distinguish it from the industry's demand curve. AR is the same thing as demand in this case. In long-run equilibrium, all firms in a perfectly competitive market break even. That is, they only earn enough accounting profits to keep them in business. In the long run, they can earn no more than this, since if they did, new competitors would flood into the market seeking the economic profits that would result. The industry supply curve would thus shift to the right and the price would go down. They can earn no less than this because if they were earning less profit than could be earned elsewhere, they would exit the market. This would shift the industry supply curve to the left and bring the price up until that break-even equilibrium was restored. The diagram in the center illustrates a firm earning short-run economic profits. Let us say in this case an increase in market demand occurs, shifting the demand curve to the right. This shift results in a higher market price of $25 instead of the 20 in the earlier diagram. In all cases, firms will choose to produce where MR equals MC. At a price and marginal revenue of $25, the firm increases production from 8 units to 10 units. Note that by doing this, the firm has moved off of the most productively efficient point on its ATC curve, from an average cost of $20 per unit to a new average cost of $20.33 per unit. The firm has now become productively inefficient. This does not bother the firm, of course, because the firm is not trying to maximize productive efficiency, but trying to maximize profit. By increasing production at the higher price, the firm can now realize an economic profit above and beyond that which would have been possible elsewhere. Happy days are here again. But this is only temporary. Other investors see this profit and enter the market to get a piece of the action. As they do, they will drive the industry supply curve to the right and bring the price right back down to $20. All firms in the industry will then reduce production back to 8 units again, and equilibrium will be restored. Note that while all the firms will charge $20 per unit and produce 8 units, there are now more firms in the industry. Thus, the market equilibrium quantity will be greater than before. In the final diagram on the right, we see economic losses. Here, industry demand decreased, sending prices down. The MR curve for the firm shifts downward, as does the intersection of industry supply and demand. In this case, the intersection in MR and MC curves shifts to the left. The firm reduces production to 7, but it is now incurring losses because the price, MR, is now $17 per unit, while its cost per unit is $20.14 per unit. If these losses continue for any length of time, the firm will go out of business and seek higher returns on investment elsewhere. As firms leave the industry, of course, the industry supply curve shifts to the left and price will rise right back up to $20 again. Firms will then increase production back to 8 units and equilibrium in the industry will be restored. Note that this time, however, there will be fewer firms than before and the market quantity will be less. Of course, cost conditions can change as well. New production technology or the discovery of new resources would shift cost curves downward, while natural disasters or increased government taxation or regulation would shift cost upward. Of course, in a perfectly competitive model, these changes are immediate and costlessly adopted by all competitors. Let us examine how government-imposed tax would impact a competitive market. Let's say the government imposes a uniform annual tax that's the same for each firm, regardless of production or profit. This might, for example, be a license fee needed to legally operate. Because the amount of the fee would not be dependent on production, the fee would be a fixed cost. Thus, ATC would rise at all possible levels of production, while AVC and the MC curves would remain unchanged. Prior to the tax, the market was in equilibrium, at price P0 and quantity Q0. Now, with the higher cost of doing business, firms would begin incurring losses and begin exiting the marketplace. Note as firms left the market supply curve would shift to the left, reducing market or industry supply from Q0 to Q1. As a result, the equilibrium price would rise to P1. Each firm would increase production to Q1 and losses would disappear for those remaining firms. The opposite, of course, would happen with a fixed government subsidy, as this would lower costs and increase supply. This would draw additional firms into the market as well as draw economic resources away from other unsubsidized industries. The model does not consider this impact across different industries and considers either outcome, tax or no tax, subsidy or no subsidy, equally efficient, since in either case P equals MC and price is equal to average total cost at whatever output results from the tax or subsidy. At this point, you might ask, why would the firm choose to produce anything at all if it was losing money? Why not just go out of business right away? The reason, according to the model, is that even if the firm stopped all production, it would still have to pay its fixed costs. Remember, the fixed costs, like payments for capital, are not dependent on production. All those buildings and machines must still be maintained and paid for even if they're shut down. You will lose money, or at least not make the kind of money you might make elsewhere, but here at least in the short run, you'll want to minimize your losses. The distance between the average total cost and average variable cost in the diagram here is the average fixed cost. As long as the price falls within that zone between average total cost and average variable cost, the firm is at least covering part of its fixed costs, and it will continue to produce. It is only when the price falls below the average variable cost that the firm will find that its losses will exceed the fixed costs and it will make sense to shut down completely. In the diagram here, marginal revenue equals marginal cost at a price of $35. At a price of $35, the losses are equal to the fixed costs for the firm. The firm sells 150 units for $35 each. The firm's revenue then is $35 times 150, or $5,250. At this level of production, let us assume that A in the diagram is equal to $40. This will be the firm's average cost per unit of output. At 150 units of production, the firm's total costs are then equal to 40 times 150, or $6,000. The firm's losses then would be the total cost minus the total revenue, and this would come to $750. This would be equal to the firm's fixed cost. If the price were to fall below $35, the average total cost would rise, while average revenue in this case would remain constant, but losses would now exceed fixed costs. It would then make sense to simply shut the plant down and keep the losses to the level of the fixed cost, rather than to continue to produce and have losses exceed the fixed costs. Of course, in the long run, defined as sufficient time to liquidate or sell the firm's fixed assets, the firm would simply go out of business or exit the industry. As some of you may have surmised, there are problems with this model. Mathematically, it seems rather elegant, and it does at least explain somewhat how markets respond to consumer demand and how markets efficiently allocate scarce economic resources. But we should not take this model as anything even remotely resembling a real marketplace. Is it possible that all firms would be identical to one another? That no entrepreneur would, by virtue of superior skill, better access to resources or information, or even dumb luck, might get an advantage over another firm? Would such a mathematically perfect world be even desirable? Is the perfect competition model even internally coherent? If all firms, for example, had access to all relevant information as the model suggests, would they not anticipate all changes in market conditions and exit or enter the industry in precise timing with all those changes? But if they all exited or entered at the same instant, would that not foil all their plans by either emptying the market completely, driving supply to zero and prices to infinity, or grossly overcrowd the market, driving supply to infinity and prices to zero? This would thus cause an immediate reversal of all the plans. It would be similar to a photocell light switch that controls a light pointed directly at its sensor. The photocell turns off the light each time it senses light, and thus the light would cycle on and off endlessly and at infinite speed. The best we can hope for with this particular model is that it will remain perpetually in equilibrium, never changing in any way, because any change would cause the model to completely collapse from its own contradictions. In the market, there's no such thing as an equilibrium price. There's only the market price, and it is discovered not via some static model postulating perfect competition, but from the dynamic interaction between the various market participants. Entrepreneurs are not some kind of model-driven robots reacting to impersonal forces, but thinking and acting human beings, anticipating and reacting, never perfectly, to consumer demand and seeking to fulfill their dreams and desires as they perceive them. Government taxes and subsidies do not reflect consumer preferences, but political rent-seeking by powerful interest groups. Even if price equals marginal cost, taxes still rob some to subsidize others, thus moving the economy's output away from genuine consumer preferences and making it less efficient. Tax and subsidies are inherently inefficient, regardless of what the model says. Far from being perfectly competitive, the perfect competition model is in fact anti-competitive. It could only be put in place under the most strict form of command and control. Perfect competition is in fact the command economy of perfect equality dreamed up by Marx and Lenin. The only way all firms could be identical is for them to be forced into such a model. Tragically, what makes this discussion more than an interesting intellectual exercise is that government policy is often based on an attempt to realize the model in practice. Government taxes, laws, and regulations typically try to ensure markets mimic this incoherent model, preventing both progress and efficiency in the name of equality. Firms often have what is called excess profits that are taxed away to fund unneeded and wasteful government projects, or to subsidize inefficient firms or bloated but politically influential industries. Farms and so-called green energy subsidies are just the most obvious examples of this.